Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons, and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. I'm Dr. Jade Teta. Welcome to the show, everybody. Today, we're going to be covering one of the most useful clinically tools that I have found for binge eating. And so right off the bat, I'll make a confession. Many of you who have been listening to this podcast for a very long time know that I am someone I come from an Italian American background. We love our food. I tend to be someone who definitely can overeat. I find myself a huge food lover. In my family, food is love. It's sort of one of these things where it's like, if you don't want to eat, people think something's wrong with you, right? And I grew up this way, and so I still have a very big appetite. Add to that the fact that in my early days of bodybuilding and powerlifting, there was this idea that you had to eat constantly in order to perform and get stronger and get bigger. And of course, there is some truth to that, but also those bad habits followed me into, sort of older age. And now at 50, at a position where I really don't want to be eating that much. And I have developed several tools. Now, of course, this is not a tool that just works for me. Let me say that off the bat, because unfortunately, we all know that we live in a health and fitness industry where people act as if something works for them, it's going to work for everyone. And that's a huge mistake. In fact, I would argue that the entire health and fitness industry makes this mistake constantly. Healthcare professionals, they are not immune to novelty bias, nor are they immune to this idea that this effect where if it works for them, it works for everybody. Obviously, we should all know better, but this is a human condition. I even do it at times. I have to remind myself. You should be reminding yourself. If you're a practitioner, you should always be looking out for this. It's not appropriate for us to go, this works for me, so that everyone else should be using it. Let me just talk a little bit about that really quickly. And I like the model from Brendon Burchard, who is a New York Times bestselling author. He got his start with a program called Expert Academy, where he taught entrepreneurs how to bring their businesses online. He was one of my early teachers in that regard. And he had a model of experts that I really liked. And his model basically was that there are 3 types of experts. There are role models. These are people who get the results themselves. There are researchers, people who know the body of literature and are well-read and well-researched, and maybe they even do the research themselves. And then there are results getters. And these are the people on the ground working with lots and lots of clients. And one of the things that you'll find very quickly when you're in the world of health and fitness is that the results getters are the ones who seem to be the ones who know the most, even if they're not up necessarily on all the research. PhD researchers and people like that who don't work in clinic, they don't understand to the same degree that a clinician would, that research is a tool for averages, not individuals. Now, of course, averages, that means most people are going to get results from that stuff. However, we are all incredibly different. And so results getters are the ones who seem to be the best, because they work with lots and lots and lots and lots of different people. And so they get a good sense that there is no one size fits all. Whereas researchers tend to think if a research study shows something, then everyone's going to benefit from that. And role model experts tend to think if I do it, then it's going to work for everyone. Now, ideally, experts should be a bit of all three, right? An expert who can, sort of walk the talk, an expert who knows the research, and an expert who has worked with many, many clients. So from my perspective, my results getter expertise is where I'm coming from on this, despite the fact that this is something that I use very effectively when I'm using it. And that's a whole other thing here, right? It's like we all know as humans that there are tools that we know work for us, that are highly effective for us, and that we still don't do for whatever reason. Partly because sometimes we just like to hang out with family, and we like to eat, and we like to, binge, and we like to do those things despite knowing it might not be the best for us. And of course, this is part of the human dilemma. But today we're going to talk about a technique that works incredibly well for me as someone who can fall prey to binge eating, and has worked incredibly well for all of my clients, especially the ones who can do it. And these are preloads and postloads. Preload proteins and postload proteins. So you might say, well, first of all, let's cover what a preload is. A preload is a substance in the research that essentially is used prior to a meal to stave off a hunger during that meal. Ideally, it's something that you take prior to a meal that causes you to eat less at that meal. And even more ideally, it's something that you take before a meal that makes you eat less of that, so much less at that meal that even the calories in the thing plus the meal create a less of an effect than would be otherwise, right? In other words, there's no point of taking a preload that has 300 calories and then eating 1,000-calorie meal and getting a total of 1,300 calories. And, ultimately, another meal, which is still 1,300 calories if you were sort of left alone without the preload, right? So that doesn't make a difference. What you want is you want a preload that has 300 calories and then causes you to eat, 700 calories at the meal. So you're only taking in 1,000 calories when you normally would have been eating 1,300 calories. So this is part of what we're talking about a preload. It's something that should cause you to eat so much less at the meal that you eat less overall, even including the calories from that preload. Now, the simplest preload would be water. Of course, there's no calories in water or not, but water can act as a preload. If you drink 2 big glasses of water before a meal, it can cause you to eat less simply by stomach distension, stretch receptors in the stomach, shutting down some hunger. You can get some effects with just water as a preload. And most people who are in the health and fitness industry use this to their advantage. We know that taking in water as a preload is a great approach. Of course, there are historic preloads, things like bitters, especially salads and greens and things like that prior to the meal. We know that bitters and salads, which have bitters in them, and vinegars and things like that, can cause changes in certain incretins like GLP-1 and other incretins that shut down hunger to some degree. And these have very little calories as well. So these are things like apple cider vinegars, balsamic vinegars, lemon juice, coffee, cocoa powder, any kind of bitter or just straight bitters, that you put in your alcoholic beverages and things like that. These can be effective preloads. So all of these preloads can make a difference, and you can do lots of different types of preloads. Obviously the ideal preload would have no calories in it. And we've even seen research on taking this preload concept to a little bit more useful concept where you actually within the meal eat the meal in a particular order so that you're eating the protein perhaps and the vegetables first before you eat the starches and the fats. So for example, let's say you have a chicken breast with some broccoli and a baked potato with butter on it. In this concept, you would eat the chicken and the broccoli first, then follow up the baked potato. And the thought there being that perhaps you end up eating less of the baked potato and you become full. Now, one research study on this showed that there was no weight loss with this approach, but it did help with blood sugar balance. And of course, that tells you that perhaps over time that could have resulted in some weight loss for those people. So that's ultimately what we're talking about here when we talk about preloads. And so if you've never heard of this concept, many of you professionals have. I have a lot of professionals who listen to this podcast. You obviously know about Preloads. Many of you who are the lay public, who are not in the health and fitness industry, but are just fitness and health enthusiasts, may not have heard of Preloads. And this is an exciting area for you because they can make a very big difference, actually. So let's talk about the preload concept of then protein really quickly. What does protein do? Well, we know that protein is the most satiating macronutrient. Now, when we talk about satiating, this is hunger suppression, right? So there's satiation, which is short-term hunger suppression, and then there's satiety, which is long-term hunger suppression. We know that protein is very good at short-term hunger suppression. So if you include it in a meal, it tends to fill you up faster during that meal. And we also know that it is great for satiety. In other words, it lasts. So for 4 to 6 hours, the more protein you have at a meal, the next 4 to 6 hours, you're probably going to have more satiety. You're going to get satiation short-term and long-term satiety, hopefully for 4 to 6 hours, so you don't end up snacking. Protein can be really good in that regard, and especially if you use lean protein sources. Not that there's anything wrong with fat. Fat is very healthy. It's something that we absolutely need. It's just that why add the extra calories if you're trying to lose weight? Why not just stick with lean protein so you get less calories? So this would be a chicken breast versus, let's say, a ribeye steak. Now, of course, once again, we have to understand that everyone is individual. So for some people, protein might be great for short-term satiation, but is not as good as fat for them for long-term satiety. And you would have to understand this. Some people do much better with satiety by having a little bit more fat in their diet. And even some people do much better with satiety by doing a little bit more carbohydrate in their diet. And so when it comes to satiety, long-term hunger suppression, this is a very individual, but we do know, at least in the research, and I will tell you in my clinical experience, it's one of the most powerful things, which is why we're having this conversation, that protein is incredibly powerful used as a preload. I'm sorry to break into the show, but I wanted to take a second to cover one of our sponsors and tell you all about Paleo Valley at paleovalley.com. These are the grass-fed sticks that I tell you all so much about that all of my friends know I have on hand constantly. They are in my car. They are at my house. I keep them at my sister's home and my parents' house. I have these things everywhere because they are the simplest, most convenient whole foods protein supplement you can get. Almost like carrying around pure protein, low-carb protein in your pocket. They also, these Paleo Valley beef sticks, are the only 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef sticks on the market. They use organic spices. They are naturally fermented instead of using nitrates and nitrites that can be a problem in some of these cured meats. And they simply taste fantastic. Check out the original or the jalapeno. Those are my favorites. Please make sure you go over to paleovalley.com and visit. When checking out, use the code NEXTLEVEL for a 15% discount. Remember, our sponsors keep the show going by you giving them your patronage and spending your money on these high quality products. You actually do a few things. One, you're helping to support the podcast. And two, you are helping your health. And three, you are making sure that good quality companies like Paleo Valley can be out there doing their business, changing the world, making the earth better. One of the things you may not know about this is that grass-fed organic and grass-finished beef is doing something that is so utterly important for our environment, actually helping to repopulate the topsoil. A lot of people don't know this, but our topsoil is being extremely depleted. And raising animals, especially cattle, the correct way helps to get that topsoil back. This is one of the reasons why I love Paleo Valley. Not to mention it tastes fantastic, but they're one of these companies, like my other sponsors, Cured Nutrition and Organifi, that are doing the right things by the environment. I really appreciate everything they do, and I hope you will check them out. Thanks so much. PaleoValley.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now back to the show. What about a postload? Now, this is my term. This is not a term you'll find anywhere in the research, whereas preloads are well defined in the research. A postload comes from my clinical experience that basically essentially says exactly what you think. So a preload comes before the meal. A postload comes after the meal. So why would we use a postload? We use a postload because oftentimes we all know what this is like, right? Where you might be full, but you're not dessert full, right? You could still get a taste of dessert. And you still could eat more depending on if someone brings something else, or you just have a taste for something and you want to keep eating after a meal. This is where binging comes from. So you can also use protein as a post load to shut down hunger. And part of this does come from something that we call the protein sparing hypothesis, or perhaps the protein leverage hypothesis. There's this idea that at least we see in rat studies, and it looks like there is some preliminary research in humans. This might also be true, and of course it makes sense that if you take rats and you give them low protein rat chow, and they eat that chow, what they will do is they will continue to eat large amounts of food until they reach an optimal amount of protein, and then they will stop. In other words, if you give them low protein chow, they continue eating and eating and eating until they meet their amino acid needs. And this might be going on with humans as well. In my opinion, it likely is. Of course, we always need more study to be definitive in our statements. So to me, a postload essentially goes, okay, you're still hungry after that meal. You're still wanting to binge. Let's put a highly satiating, protein load on board. Now, the best way to do this is protein shakes. Why? Because they tend to be very low calorie as well. And you also want to look at the timing here. So let's go back to preloads real quick, and then we'll come back to postloads. In the research, there really is a timing effect here. Obviously, if you have a protein shake 3 hours before a meal, that's not really a preload. A preload typically is done best within an hour and probably within 30 minutes of a meal. So what this means is you're actually having like this protein shake, this snack, right before your meal. And sometimes you literally can do it right before your meal. I tell you, I binge a lot. I can, embarrassingly do that a lot, despite the fact I'm in the health and fitness world. We all know just because you know better doesn't mean you always do better. And one of the effects when I'm doing very well with my diet and really wanting to be careful with my diet is when I go visit my parents, who, like, let's say on a Friday evening or Saturday evening, we haven't done this in a while as a family, but we used to do Saturday and Sunday night dinners all together. And so what I would do to mitigate overeating at those meals is I would tend to fast all day. And then I would, right before I went to the meal, I would work out. And then right after my workout, I would have a protein shake of about 30 to 40 grams. And then I would immediately eat. And this was fantastic on allowing me to not overdrink and not overeat. And of course, part of the reason I came up with this was because reading research, trying it in my clients and them getting such good results that I was like, this is probably going to work for me. And it does work wonderfully. And it works wonderfully for, I'm telling you, the vast majority of clients over my career. And there are very few things in the health and fitness industry that work for the vast majority of people. Usually it's like a third of people it's going to work for, a third of people it's not going to work for, right? And a third of people, like a third of people is going to work for, a third of people it's going to make them worse, right? And the third of people it's not going to have any real effect. But in this case, I would argue that probably 70 to 80% of people who try this are going to get good results from it. So you really want to take this preload as close to the meal as possible. And it should be as low calorie as possible so we can mitigate this idea of, hey, I eat a 300 calorie, preload, and then I end up eating, the same, quality of meal or less than 300. In other words, I end up eating more as a result of the preload because the preload didn't quite, reduce my food intake at that coming meal as much as I thought it would. And so the idea here is to have preloads that are low calorie, but feel like more calories. And protein shakes are great for this. For example, you can have a approximately 20 gram, whey protein shake, just whey protein, for under 100 calories or around 100 calories. And it can offset your meal by 150 to maybe 400 calories. That's the kind of preload that we want. Preferably somewhere between 20 and 40 grams of whey protein or protein powder, about 100 to 200 calories within 30 minutes of a coming meal to try to decrease the calories of that meal by 300 to 500 so that we end up in a calorie deficit overall. That's the ideal approach. And of course, you can stack these preloads if you want as well. So yeah, you basically go, all right, I'm going to have that protein shake within 30 minutes of my meal. Then when I get to the meal, I'm going to have, some water, maybe a big tall glass of water and a green salad. And then I'm going to start to eat that meal. And maybe I'll eat that meal with my protein and my vegetables first and the carbs sort of last. And then ultimately you'll see by doing this that you are filling yourself up. It's very similar to the idea of, we used to talk about, and of course this works as well and can kind of be seen as, sort of a roundabout preload. And that's chewing your food slowly and being mindful, giving yourself time to feel full, giving your body time to get the signal that you are eating rather than scarfing your food down. That is, sort of in the same vein. So now add to that preload stacking, mindful, slow eating. And you may find that in a very effortless way, with adding one small change, this preload and this way of doing your meals, you end up eating much, much less. And over time, you end up having some accidental or effortless weight loss. That's what we're talking about here. Now, real quick on protein shakes in general, there's a difference between a protein shake, protein shake and a protein meal replacement. Protein shakes are typically just protein. For example, this would be like whey protein or hemp protein or soy protein or pea protein or rice protein or some kind of blend that is just the protein with almost no fat and almost no carb, right? Versus a protein meal replacement, which would have some fat, some carb, and some protein in it. Now, either of these will work as preloads. It's just that sometimes that protein meal replacement will add much more calories than perhaps you require. And so sometimes when you just stick with protein, you get lower calories, more bang for your buck, so to speak. Also, of course, with protein powders and meal replacement shakes, you want to find something that you like. And you also don't want to add these in super quick into your diet because like vegetables, protein can be tough to digest. You want to reduce the risk of bloating, foul gas, upset, diarrhea, constipation, that kind of thing. So don't add this in super fast, especially if you're someone who's sensitive to protein and or add a digestive enzyme. Now, let's briefly talk about postloads and then we can wrap up this podcast for today. Now, a postload is essentially a protein dessert in a sense, right? So it's something that after your meal, we all know this effect where after your meal, you're just like, I want a taste of something else. So then you go and get a handful of nuts or you get some chips or now you need some popcorn or now you want some cheesecake or cookies or wine or something like that. And so when that happens, as soon as you start feeling yourself with that extra craving, the idea behind this postload is, okay, perhaps I did not get enough protein into my meal and I'm still hungry as a result. Now, of course, when we talk about wanting to eat after a meal, oftentimes this blends hunger into cravings. The truth of the matter is that protein can do a little bit for both of those. Actually, protein can be very good for hunger and cravings because the two sort of overlap. Hunger is sort of more in the gut and gut mechanisms, the incretins, some of these hunger hormones like CCK and ghrelin and GLP and GIP and PYY and, those kinds of things. And then up in the brain for cravings, we tend to think about that more of neurotransmitter stuff like, dopamine and serotonin balance and things like that. Of course, this is an area that really is not well studied, at least the craving aspect. We do know, at least the research heavily hints that cortisol and stress is involved here. And of course, whey protein and amino acids can be precursors to dopamine and serotonin and lower cortisol. And so protein will have an effect here as well. And so a postload is essentially doing the same thing you did with the preload. Just once you start feeling, hey, I'm not as satisfied, I am having cravings and or I'm still somewhat hungry, then you have more of that protein shake as like a protein dessert after the meal. And this is essentially staving off future calories snacking late into the night. And both of these work incredibly well. Now, the reason I wanted to do this podcast is because I get this question all the time, and it's been happening, more lately. And of course, a lot of what I share here on this podcast comes from a lot of what you all are asking, what I'm getting in my DMs, what's coming through, in terms of emails and things like that. And so I've been getting a lot of, hey, I'm binging. How do I shut off hunger? How do I deal with cravings? How do I stop eating once I finish a meal? And of course, preloads and postloads are one of these super simple, highly effective things that have, at least in the preload world, a lot of good research on them that not a lot of people use and know about. Sometimes these things that we know about, we know work, because they're not as sexy as the newfangled thing, they oftentimes are, sort of forgotten about. And I just wanted to remind everyone how powerful these things are. And one of the things I have found in my clinical career is that small little things, small changes that you can make, that you can easily incorporate into your habits and your meal structures and your exercise and your daily routines can have big, big dividends. And preloads and postloads definitely can do that. And so that's why I wanted to cover them. And so once again, preloads before the meal, really 20 to 40 grams of protein ideally, and postloads, same thing, after the meal, 20 to 40 grams of protein in the shape of or form of shakes. These things can make a big difference. Now, the final thing I'll say here is you might say, well, Jade, I don't like shakes. Can I just use a chicken breast, or can I use some other lean protein source? Absolutely, you can. So this would look like, basically having, and we do this stuff too, like think of a charcuterie board, right? Where you have meats and cheeses. Imagine whenever you're putting out hors d'oeuvres or whenever you're putting out appetizers, you do protein appetizers. This, in a sense, is a very easy way to do a preload. So instead of getting chips or French fries or jalapeno poppers or any of these kinds of things where what you want to do is you want to look at, what am I doing for my appetizer? So I'll put out a charcuterie board that's a little different. Instead of, pepperonis and salamis and things like that, maybe I'm having, a low calorie cheese along with, chicken breast. So maybe you'll do something like a caprese chicken platter where it's tomato and basil and a low, sort of fat, high quality mozzarella with a strip of grilled chicken breast on top. And maybe that is your appetizer. And that appetizer then acts as the preload. And of course, then you can stack on top of that another preload as a salad and stack on top of that water prior to the meal. And one thing I'll say about water here, people often go, well, isn't water going to mess up your digestion? No, it's not going to dilute your digestive secretions or anything like that. In fact, it's probably going to improve your digestion. The only thing you have to watch out for water is people who have GERD and things like that. Sometimes you can distend your stomach enough where you get some heartburn and things like that. But water is highly effective in this way. And no, it's not going to dilute your gastric secretions and cause digestive issues. In fact, more likely it's going to have the opposite effect. Of course, you don't want to drink a whole gallon of water with your meal, but drinking 2 cups of water, a cup of water before the meal and a cup of water during the meal is probably going to be really useful for you. So I'm not going to ramble on here, but I do want to remind you of how powerful preloads and postloads are. So I hope you enjoy this. Please try this. Hit me up with a DM, shoot me an email if you listen to this, if you have any questions. But I really am curious on how powerful this is going to be for you. So try it and let me know. And I am going to see you all at the next show.
You have been listening to the Next Level Human podcast with Dr. Jade Teta. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you subscribe and consider leaving a review. You make the biggest difference when you pass on your lessons and inspire others. That's why reviews like this are so powerful. Your words may be the only ones that resonate for someone else. Please remember the information in this podcast is for educational purposes only. Always consult your personal physician or therapist before making any lifestyle changes. And finally, thank you for who you are in the world and the difference you make.